Thank you all for showing up, and thank you for inviting me. I have to say I'm thrilled to be in Colorado to talk about Right to Try, because Colorado, as some of you may know, is the very first Right to Try state. You were the pioneers. Right to Try passed it with bipartisan support. It actually had bipartisan co-sponsors, which is exciting nowadays to find an issue that isn't polarizing but actually brings people together on both sides of the political aisle. So again, very, very thrilled to be here to talk about it. I want to start by giving you a little bit of idea of why we wrote the Right to Try laws at the Goldwater Institute. And one minor correction, which is actually a big deal to me, we're actually not located in Washington, D.C. We're located in Phoenix, Arizona. The reason that's a big deal is because Washington gridlock is almost impossible to beat. One of the things about the Goldwater Institute that makes us unique is that we work within the states to try to find solutions to protect people's rights and to defend constitutionally limited government, something that is rare indeed in Washington, D.C. So although those of us who live out here in the West know that sometimes our friends back east forget about us, we do exist, and the Goldwater Institute exists to defend your freedoms. Let me give you an idea about why we passed Right to Try, what the impetus was behind that, what Right to Try does, and then I'll talk a little bit about the limitations. It's dangerous when you give a lawyer a microphone, because if you don't pry it out of my hands eventually, we may be here all night, and I may be the only one that you hear from. So I will try to keep my remarks brief.
Here on your own.
I often am. Started out with a standing ovation. I don't know if I'll end with one, but
I am hanging on every word.
Are you? Well, okay, all right. Let me start by telling you a bit of a story to sort of set the stage for why we designed Right to Try laws. Now, I want to tell you about a young man named Diego Morris. Diego Morris is from Arizona. He was 10 years old when he was told that he was going to die. He woke up one morning. It seemed like just like any other day, except for that he had a little bit of a sore leg. Now, Diego is an amateur soccer player. Even though he was only 10 years old, he was very good at soccer. He wanted to grow up to be a star soccer player, and his mother sort of chalked up the soreness in his leg to just, being Diego. Boys will be boys at 10 years old, and he probably overexerted himself on the field. But it didn't go away, and after a week of the same pain, Diego's mom said, well, we better take him into the doctor. So they went into the doctor, and the doctor ran a series of tests, called Diego and his parents back into the office and said, I have some news. And Diego's mother wondered, well, what kind of news could it be? I mean, what could possibly be wrong with a 10-year-old boy who seemed in very good health? And Diego's doctor broke the news to Diego's parents. They heard the news that no parent should ever have to hear. Diego was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is a rare form of bone cancer. It is fatal in 33% of the people that it affects, and it is particularly bad in young people. Diego's mom, of course, was distraught. She never would have imagined that her 10-year-old son would have been diagnosed with cancer, and she asked the doctor, okay, what do we do about this? And the doctor sighed, and he said, well, of course, we'll start him on chemotherapy. But unfortunately, even if the chemo works, it is very likely with this type of disease that it will come back. And when it comes back, it's very likely that it will take Diego's life. And Diego's mother said, okay, well, what are our other options? What else can we do? I mean, you cannot be telling me that my 10-year-old boy who was just playing soccer the other day is not going to live. And the doctor said, well, there actually is a treatment. There's a treatment that's been proven to be very effective. It's actually available in many developed nations. It's available in Israel. It's available in Europe. And if taken a couple weeks after chemotherapy, it's shown to be extremely successful. Usually the cancer does not come back, and people go on to live healthy, happy lives. So Diego's mom said, excellent. When do we start that treatment? And the doctor looked at them and said, well, unfortunately, you can't start this treatment because it's not legal within the United States. The FDA will not let you take this drug. Diego's mother was shocked that in a country where we often develop these kinds of treatments because we are free to be able to be entrepreneurial, we are not free to be able to take those treatments to save our lives. And so Diego's mother had to make a difficult choice. She pulled Diego, 10 years old, away from his friends, away from his family and his support system, took him out of school, and they not only traveled to England, they moved to England for an entire year so that he could get the life-saving treatment that he needed. Now, Diego's story has a happy ending because I'm glad to tell you that, in fact, the treatment worked. Diego was cured, and he actually interned at the Goldwater Institute last summer. I got to know Diego very well. He told me that although he's still holding out to be a star soccer player, he has a newfound love of public policy. Diego has traveled the country with me and my colleagues, helping us pass right-to-try laws in the states because he knows he wants everybody to be able to have the opportunity that he had. See, Diego's family luckily had means to travel and live in England. Many people in the United States cannot afford to uproot their lives and move to another country in order to get life-saving treatment. So I asked myself, and my colleagues asked themselves, why is that? Why is it that in the land of the free and the home of the brave, you aren't free to be able to take life-saving medication that could help you? And that's because in the United States, we have become a permission society. You have to beg the government for the right to try to save your own life. You can't take any medication without having government permission, and when it comes to saving your life, it becomes even harder. In the United States nowadays, it can take about a decade and $1 billion for potentially life-saving medication to make its way to market. A decade and $1 billion. Imagine if you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness and someone told you, well, there's a great promising treatment, but it's about 8 years away from being approved. You can't wait 8 years. Some people can't wait 8 weeks. Some people can't wait 8 days. Now, I know none of you actually have cell phones out in front of you because you're hanging on my every word, so you're not looking at your phones. And this is actually one of the few audiences where people actually aren't looking at their phones. So I'm thrilled to see that. But when you take out your cell phone, can you imagine if that cell phone were 8 years old and you were trying to get directions to come here? It would not happen. You would not rely on 8-year-old technology in order to make a phone call, so why should you have to rely on a decade-old technology in order to try to save your life? It is absolutely ridiculous that happens in this country. And so before we get into the specifics about why that is, my colleagues and I said, we work at an organization that's based on principles, and so we said we need to go back to first principles when we look at the FDA's framework. And the foundation of any free society is that you own your own body. So the right to medical autonomy, or the right to make your own medical decisions, is absolutely fundamental. It is the most fundamental right of all. And if you are free to make your own medical decisions and you have the right to try to save your own life, then it is not only immoral, but it is unconstitutional for the government to stand in your way. And so that was the premise for designing right to try laws. Now, people have made those arguments, again, based on what should be a simple, basic foundational principle in a free society to the federal government to no avail. A young woman named Abigail Burroughs. Has anyone heard of Abigail Burroughs at all? Young woman was diagnosed with cancer, and similar to Diego's situation, wanted to be able to take an experimental treatment that had been shown to be very promising, had passed basic safety testing, but had not yet made it all the way through the FDA process. Keep in mind the clinical trial process is a 3 or 4 step process. The initial phase is basic safety testing, where they determine whether or not the drug will kill you. Now, after that, of course, there's a lot of testing, and this is not at all to put down the scientific process. Clinical trials are important. But a lot of times what they're doing, what takes all those years, is determining whether or not the drug is effective, determining dosage, things that are, of course, important for final market guidance. But when you're dying and you're out of hope, there really is nothing else that's effective out there. You're going to die, so, even if the drug isn't going to be effective, you want some hope. You want to try something. So this is the situation that Abigail was in, and so she asked the federal government for permission to be able to try this medication, and the FDA told her no. Now, unfortunately, Abigail passed away. But her father continued this fight, and he actually formed a group called Abigail Alliance, which many of you may have heard of. They still exist today. They're a fantastic group. And they took the fight to court. They went to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the second highest court in the United States, And a three-judge panel in the D.C. Circuit said, yes, absolutely, the Due Process Clause of the Constitution protects your fundamental right to try a medicine that has passed basic safety testing but has not yet made it to final approval when you have no other government-approved options. And then the FDA petitioned for what is called a rehearing. You can ask the full circuit of an federal appellate court to hear your case, so every single judge on the court. And in the rehearing, what we call an en banc rehearing, the court reversed that decision and said, you don't have a fundamental right to take these medications. What you have is a liberty interest. Now, the difference between a fundamental right and a liberty interest is something only a lawyer could love, right? What does that actually mean in real life? Well, a liberty interest is what courts or what lawyers use when they want to consider that right a second-class right. So fundamental rights we protect. Fundamental rights like freedom of speech, for example. If the government wants to infringe on your freedom of speech, it has to prove that its regulation is necessary to protect the public. But when it wants to infringe on a liberty interest, well, then judges basically, cover their eyes, cover their ears, and rubber stamp what the government does. You have to prove that you are free to be able to act in a country where we have a constitution that's supposed to protect you from those kinds of regulations. So the Supreme Court never took the case. The Supreme Court has never considered the issue of right to try or anything like that regarding safe drugs. And unfortunately, it stopped there. Now, the D.C. Circuit doesn't have jurisdiction over the entire United States. And since then, people have gone to the federal government, they've gone to Congress, they've gone to the FDA, and they have begged for a solution. They have begged for a break to be able to take these medications when they're out of hope. To no avail, because we know how hard it is to get things done in Washington. So this is the circumstances that we found ourselves in at the Goldwater Institute, and we decided that we were going to try to do something in the states. So we designed the right to try law. Now, what is the right to try? The right to try is actually a very modest law. Probably many of you in this room will think that that the law should reflect something much broader, and I would join you in that. But again, you see how difficult these fights are, both in courts and in the legislature. So we thought we need to start small because it's important to take a first step. So what the right to try law does is it says that if you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, you've exhausted all of your government-approved options, and your doctor knows of an investigational medication that he thinks might work for you. It's past basic safety testing, so in other words, the drug won't kill you, but your disease will, then you should have the right to try that medication, even if it might not work, because you own your own body, and you should have the right to make those decisions with your doctor. The federal government should not be able to make those decisions for you. So that's what a right to try law does. Yes, absolutely. Standing ovation for right to try. That's what it does. It's modest, right? It's conservatively designed. But what we say is, look, there are drugs out there that can be very harmful. There are drugs out there that can kill you. But dying patients, terminal patients, face a different risk-benefit calculus. And what the FDA thinks it needs to do is protect you from yourself or protect you from bad decisions. The FDA thinks that unless we know for certain that a drug is going to work for you, you shouldn't be able to have the freedom to take it. And that is just wrong. The FDA should be concerned with protecting people, but it shouldn't be concerned with protecting people from the freedom to choose. And unfortunately, that's the situation we have. So we designed right to try laws for that reason. Now, some people might ask, well, how does state laws really come into play here? Isn't the FDA a federal agency? Those of us who took basic civics in high school know that the federal government is supreme, so doesn't the federal government or the federal laws preempt state laws? And the answer is no, not in this case. Here's the reason why. The federal Constitution provides a floor to protect constitutional rights, not a ceiling. So in other words, states can step in and protect your rights to a greater extent than the federal government, and states can step in and protect your rights when the federal government fails to do so. That is not a flaw in our system. That is by design. Our founding fathers designed a system, what James Madison called, I know you've all read your Federalist Papers. I keep mine by my nightstand. And in Federalist 51, James Madison said that the federal system, the state-federal dynamic system, provides a double security to the rights of the people. So our federal government has failed to protect us. And so the states are going to step in and protect us. And in fact, the Supreme Court, although it hasn't determined this issue at all, has been very favorable in such instances. So some of you might have heard of the case in Oregon when Gonzalez versus Oregon is the name of the case, 2007, which is almost 10 years ago. It's amazing to me that almost 10 years have gone by since that case came out. But basically, their Oregon voters passed a right to die law, which is in some sense is similar to right to try, and in some sense it's very different. But it says that if you have a terminal illness and you've exhausted all of your options and you want to pursue death with dignity, that you're able to do so. The voters passed that in Oregon, and the federal attorney general came in and said, federal law says that you can't do that. You have no right to physician-assisted suicide. So we're going to preempt state law. And the Supreme Court said no. States have the power to protect your right to make that choice. And so if Oregon voters want to protect your right, then they can do so. And that's exactly what Right to Try does, right? Right to Try steps in and protects your right to try to save your life. So if states can protect your right to die, they ought to be able to protect your right to try to prolong your life. And that's the argument that we're making. Now, 24 states have passed right to try laws in just 2 short years. Colorado was the first. You guys were the groundbreakers, but 24 states have passed it. And overwhelmingly successful, bipartisan support. The only state to actually reject right to try is the state of California. Surprise, surprise. Now in California, the law was actually sponsored by a very liberal Democrat. And in fact, he has reintroduced the law this legislative session. I think he's fantastic. But he sponsored the law. It passed nearly unanimously through the legislature, and then it ended up on Governor Jerry Brown's desk. Now, a week before, Governor Jerry Brown signed a right to die law into law in California. And in his signing statement, Governor Brown said, "If I ever found myself in the impossible situation of being diagnosed with a terminal illness, I would want to be able to make that decision, and I would not deny anybody else that right to choose." So when we heard that, we thought, excellent, he's going to sign right to try. And then a week later, he vetoed right to try, and he said, it's because we need to give the federal system a chance to work first. Well, dying patients have been giving the federal system a chance to work for 60 years. It's about time that we take this fight to the states. So we're going to go back to California, and we're going to try it again, and we will take it to the people if we have to. In Arizona, the law was passed by the people, by ballot initiative. And so if we have to do that in California, we will. Now, I'll close with this. Right to try is an important first step. But it's not a cure-all, it's not a silver bullet, and there are lots of limitations. First of all, one of them is the clinical trial process itself. Now, right to try is sort of an exception to the rule, right? The clinical trial process is the rule for final market approval, and again, it's very important. It's the scientific process, but we ought to streamline it. Talked to a lot of doctors and scientists since we've come up with the right to try law, and there are lots of ways. People with much more intelligence in the medical community than I have lots of good ideas about how to streamline the clinical trial process so that it can include more sick patients. Only 3% of our sickest patients are actually lucky enough to get into a clinical trial. And of course, when you get into a clinical trial, you may be given a placebo that won't do anything for you at all. So there are ways that we can streamline that process. There are ways that we can open it up to help more people so that it doesn't take 10 to 15 years to get a drug to market. There are also ways that we can use data from other countries, sometimes what people call reciprocity, right? If trusted countries that have good science in place are able to provide us with data, we ought to be able to use that to speed up the approval process so that we don't have to start from scratch here in the United States. I told you about the medicine that helped save Diego's life. That medicine has been approved in Europe since 2009. It's 2016. It's still not approved here in the United States. So we ought to be able to take into account foreign data from the scientific community and speed that process up here. Another thing is the drug companies themselves. A lot of people say, well, right to try is well and good because it cuts out that government layer, but a lot of times the drug companies don't want to make their drugs available. Now, there are times when it's totally the drug company's fault. And certainly there are big companies out there that, that are problematic. But we also don't really have a system set up that incentivizes drug companies to make drugs available. It's sort of all risk and no reward for them. Keep in mind, I just said that it takes over a decade to get these drugs through the approval process. Now imagine you're a small startup that is coming up with an innovative idea. I have no doubt that these scientists want to develop amazing cures for diseases. So you have every incentive to do that, but of course it costs money to be able to develop these drugs. And you've got to convince your investors that there's going to be a payoff at the end of the road. Now, if you're investing a lot of money through a decades-long process, the last thing you want to do is get on the wrong side of the FDA. The FDA claims that it doesn't use adverse events against a company in making its decision as to whether or not your drug will receive market approval. So what that means is if a drug company makes a drug available before it's gotten full market approval, either through Right to Try or through something called the Compassionate Use Program, which is another a whole bunch of paperwork that you have to fill out to beg the federal government for an exception to its rule. If somebody gets sick and dies from a drug that they're given through that exception, the FDA claims that it's not going to use that against a drug company in making its decision because, of course, by definition, the people taking this drug are very sick and they have compromised immune systems and they might have passed away for a number of reasons. They're not in a clinical trial. That's the whole point. But yet we know the federal government uses that data against drug companies. It's done it. It doesn't explain how it does it, and the threat is real. So companies sometimes feel like they can't take that risk to make that drug available because if you're 8 years down the road, you're 2 years away from getting your drug approved, you give that drug out to somebody and the FDA gets cross with you and tells you, guess what, we're not going to approve your drug. Well, you're out of luck and your investors are going to pull their money. So we ought to find ways to incentivize companies to be able to give this medication out. And I'll say something that might be a little controversial, but we also ought to let some companies make profits off selling these medications before they are given full market approval. Now, you might think, well, gosh, these evil, greedy companies out there, they're just going to take advantage of people. But keep in mind that these drugs are drugs that have been approved for basic safety by the FDA. They're being tested on human beings, and we have laws out there that protect against fraud. If drug companies can't make any money off the drugs that they're making available, it's going to be very hard for them to recuperate their costs. That's one of the reasons that drugs are so expensive when they first are approved for market. And there's no incentive. Let's face it, we're a profit-driven economy. There's no incentive to make a drug available if you can't make any money off it. So if you have the money, or if a charity's raised money for you and you want to be able to purchase a medication, the government shouldn't stand in your way from being able to enter into a lawful contract with a drug company. Then there are other things we ought to do to be able to make charity more available to people so that people can use charitable contributions to be able to purchase these treatments. Jonathan Johnson, who is the CEO of Overstock.com, has actually created the Right to Try Charitable Foundation, and what he's doing is raising money to be able to provide treatments to patients who want to take advantage of Right to Try but aren't able to pay for the costs of particular medications. So we ought to be doing more there. There are lots of other things that we have to do. Again, Right to Try only covers a small population. It is a first step, but it's an important first step. And it is. We know that patients are already being treated under Right to Try. I don't know how many. We are not a clearinghouse for patient treatment. What we do is pass the laws and break down the barriers so that people are able to make, to take advantage of that. But I have talked to doctors who are already making this available, and part of what we have to do is get the word out there and remove this fear of going against the system and letting people know that it is safe and it is okay to make these treatments available. Another reason I think Right to Try is important is because it is a declaration of first principles. And that is something that is very important. It's changing. We're not only changing laws, but we're changing culture. So Right to Try laws, for the first time, we've got over half the country, 24 states, which is over half the country's population, standing up and saying, we reject the fact that we have to beg the federal government for the permission to try to save our own lives. And that may not seem like much to you, but that's a big, big deal when people have been fighting for that for half a century. Are we all the way there? Absolutely not. But have we made some important strides? Absolutely. So that's what the Right to Try movement has done. And with that, I will stop monopolizing the conversation and turn it over to some of the other panelists up here. But I hope to be able to answer some of your questions when we're all done. So thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, she's here. I'm going to give y'all a big one tomorrow, but I don't want to spoil it.
A big what, hug or kiss?
Oh,
What?
there, that's all of the above.
So
The
mine,
senator is here, so
Oh,
she's
wonderful.
coming up, but you go right ahead, and I hope that you will all feel there's so much reaction going on in the crowd about, hey, there's y'all are talking under your breath. I really want Gachar to be a place where voices are heard. So please, you don't have to hide. You can, give them attaboys and all that stuff.
well, I'm just going to jump in and say that I'm quite daunted by what you've done, Christina. Thank you. You fleshed out. I was reading about the Right to Try. My name is Brad Weeks. I'm a medical doctor, and I'm very grateful to what you're doing.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm grateful to you as well.
And so I'm more in the trenches in the sense that we get people who are in a tough situation. My work has always been integrative or holistic, so we like to think that we're giving tomorrow's medicine today to patients. And there's this tyranny of what's called the standard of care. And what I'll talk about tomorrow a little bit is that you would think the standard of care is something which is appropriate. And yet I'll elaborate that really the way the standard of care is created is the insurance companies will declare to the alpha leaders in the medical profession what will be reimbursed. And after that's decided, the alpha leaders, the presidents of various societies, the presidents of the Endocrinological Society, the president of the American Academy of this or that, they will then say what they think is appropriate care, not based upon efficacy, not based upon anything other than what the insurance companies will reimburse. As consumers, you should be shocked by that. Now, what happens then is that they will declare in their annual proceedings what they recommend, and they have to say, please do not consider this to be we, the leaders, telling you what the standard of care is, because actually the standard of care is very nebulous. But with this nebulous tyranny, most doctors are conscribed and are unwilling to do something which might be in the category of a drug which is the right to try. So tomorrow I'll be speaking from the trenches perspective as the importance of the consumers. It's really up to the patients to protect their doctors. If I were to stand up to the medical board and to the Federation of State Medical Boards and say, I should be able to offer something which is in the right to try category, they would consider me self-serving. It's up to the patients to say, leave my doctor alone, who's courageous enough to offer an innovative treatment, because anything that the right to try suggests is not the standard of care. Now, if anyone has studied medical history, you know that in the history of medicine, things have been discovered, and there's a 20 to 100 year gap between when something is known to be helpful and when it's become available in the trenches. So when a gentleman, I'm just now blanking on his name, but he was, the Brits are called limeys because they were able to bring lemons and limes on board their boats and not have to hug the coastline, but instead they could go across, and the British Navy ruled the waves because they could prevent scurvy because they were eating lime and lemon on board their ships. Now, it took 100 years for the family practitioners, the general practitioners in England, to prescribe limes and lemons for scurvy. It took 100 years for them to do that after the British Navy was already using it. So I believe with the internet now, we have people coming in and say, Dr. Weeks, have you read the most recent literature from the University of Madagascar Medical Center about this and that? And of course I haven't, but thank God we have patients who are empowered who will say, I'm looking at the literature, and there's this drug over in Madagascar or in Tanzania, and what do you know about it? It really has become more of a collaborative process with patients and doctors now. And the problem is, if a patient came in and convinced the doctor that there was a great drug out there, which was not yet at the third stage of FDA approval, just the first stage of safety, the doctors will be shut down. So you're doing fabulous work. We need to have the patients understand that they need to advocate for their doctors to be free, because I trained in the East Coast. I did research at Mass General Hospital. I did my medical school at Vermont, and I did my residency at Dartmouth. Lot of certifications, a lot of credentials. But why am I practicing for many years in Washington State? It's because back in the early 90s, Washington State had a law, and it said the doctor may do whatever he or she wants to do as long as it doesn't injure the patient or create an unreasonable risk of harm. Only one state, Alaska soon thereafter. You could do something which was not the standard of care in Washington, and they could not attack you because you, the doctor, had a contract with an intelligent patient who was empowered to make decisions, and you could deliver something like chelation therapy or different innovative cancer treatments. If you did that in any other state, they would take your license away. Before I yield the microscope, what a nerd. Before I leave the megaphone here, what's happened now, which is exactly what's happening nationally, is that the state medical boards are now saying, you, the doctor, and my license was suspended because I was doing very effective treatments for cancer. So my wife always tells me I can't refer to them as patients anymore. I have to refer to them as clients. But the concept is, when I'm engaging with a patient and doing successful, innovative cancer treatments, which I'll discuss tomorrow, the medical board insinuates itself and says, if I may, Christine, you, my patient, even though you've done your research, and even though you've made a choice to do something innovative, something non-standard of care, the medical board says you are not competent to make that decision. We, the medical board, know what's an unreasonable risk of harm, and so we will not allow you to have access to that. So it's a very exciting time now because people are finding out. Over 90% of people today who get diagnosed with cancer check out integrative alternative treatments. When I trained 30 years ago, that didn't happen. People are empowered. So you guys are putting the laws together. Medical doctors are being courageous. It's a very exciting time to get cancer.
Thank you, Dr. Weeks. My name is Robert Scott Bell. I'm a homeopath with a bad attitude, and I take it to radio. I love liberty. I love this country, the basis for it, the freedom that I was taught as a child, yet I was raised in an allopathic pharmaceutical doctor family. And I knew one day I'd grow up to be a doctor because it's just one of those things I knew from when I was hardly able to walk. Except I didn't know it would be a homeopath because there was no such thing in my world, even though it was a basis for medicine in America. It was a standard of care before they had a thing called standard of care, which can't be defined. They just know it when they don't see it. And then they bust you for it. The license concept is something, I may touch on some more tomorrow, but it's really the freedom to enter into a slave relationship. You're being granted this special privilege, but in order to get this privilege, you have to subjugate yourself to dunderheads, I'm going to say that politely, that have no clue how to heal people, no clue how to respond to people in need. But as you say, just assess what are they going to cover? What are the third-party payers going to cover? And it's an interesting concept because the most dangerous thing you can have in America is good medical insurance. It's the most dangerous thing you can have. And the reason I say that is because they will make sure that you get all of the greatest invasive therapies available and tests, etc., that will guarantee these therapies that could likely kill you more than help you. Now, I'm all for the freedom to choose that if that's what you want. But growing up, the only doctors that I knew were allopathic. And I went to Emory University in Atlanta. I only found out after I graduated that they had taught homeopathy on the curriculum up until about 1949. Then I had to go back into the history books and learn about the Flexner Report of 1910 and realize that, Abraham and Simon Flexner were hired by the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations to set up, medical curricula that would be responsive only to a petrochemical patent medicine that was emerging, in the age of oil. And all of this happened over many years, and then 100 years later in 2010, President Obama sent a congratulatory letter to all of his followers to say, we did it, it's been 100 years, but we're finally here. Obamacare, right? Explain to me how he knew 100 years had transpired since 1910. Did he even know what the Flexner Report is? It just shows you more or less how they're puppets playing a game for somebody else that's pulling the strings. You lost your license, you gained your freedom. And this is a concept where we talked to Danny on radio tonight. We had it went to air tonight. I was here, but we recorded today, got it out on the air. Where what we're learning is to stop asking for permission where none is required. And in the case of healing, saving your life, it's never required. And if the Supreme Court were to rule against right to try, would that mean that it's wrong to try? Would you accept their pronouncement because there's the Supreme Court? I'll talk a little bit about the 10th Amendment tomorrow in my talk, as well as go into some innovative therapies that I've helped to develop and some work with in terms of healing the gut, which was my issue because I was 24 years chronically ill from 0 to 24, and the doctors couldn't help me until I met a homeopathic doctor who emigrated from Belgium because he was drawn to freedom in America. He would start a laboratory because he could do that. And the only reason he could do that is because they didn't know what homeopathy was. People were, the regulators were too dumb to even know what he was starting in Georgia at the time. Very interesting history there. But I, took that to another level and began to communicate this out to the world through mass media. And now we've got not only radio, but through internet, and we're reaching all over the world. And we've got listeners that really do respond to a message of liberty, a real message. This is a yearning from within. Not everybody catches that fire, but it's something that is, quite honestly been lost to most of our fellow Americans. And it isn't that they don't want it, it's just that we've been trained over the course of generations, and we've been drugged over the course of generations. And all of these things have developed over those 100 plus years where we don't even know history. So as we look to vote for a new president, if you decide to participate in that farce, you'll find that neither party has a candidate, at least currently, that knows anything about the history of medicine in America, nor could correct it. Even Republicans who say they're for a free market, they wouldn't know a free market if it bit them in the aspirin. All right. So we've got a lot of re-education, or let's say this detoxification of indoctrination to do. This and what Danny is starting here, and the movement, and what the foundation is that what you're working with the Goldwater Institute. These things are just so extraordinary. This is an exciting time, not only, as you said, to get cancer because you have opportunities opening up again, but to transform consciousness. And it's going to take not only a willingness to come to a place like this, but it's going to take a willingness to start growing your own food again. Because that's where the medicine is. It's in the dirt, dude. It's and we are right now. We have the incredible opportunity because we've got free energy. People think we don't have free energy. We have free energy. Oil is practically free energy at this point. You see what the price is. It's cheaper than when I was a kid if you adjust for inflation. That's not going to be here forever. When that happens, how are you going to get stuff shipped from across the country, much less across the world, to you? If you don't start growing food and we don't start teaching our kids to do that, there's no amount of medicine we'll be able to get, even if it's experimental, that are going to help us. We're going to be starving. And I think the reason why they didn't starve in mass in the former Soviet Union when it collapsed is that they at least knew the fallacy of relying on government. So they always grew something, potato something, they had something. And we are not in that place right now in America. We are so dependent upon government, corporations, and corporate collusion with government that they pull the rug out, whether it's on their dime or off their dime, we're in big trouble. So the reality of this recovery starts right here with what you're doing. And the cancer wake-up call, this recognition that we can't be saved from out there, has got to come from within here, and these folks here that are teaching and doing these wonderful things. Docs like this you'll learn about as well. So we got a lot to do this weekend, and I'm just excited and honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Danny. And we got a lot more to do. So it's just the beginning.
Governor Gaston.
My name is Gaston Cornula Abad. I'm an MD. I happen to practice in an area very close to where Dr. Wicks practices, and I'm in the trenches too. Right to try law, I had first-hand experience with this a few months ago when the law was passed in Texas. Because somebody, a colleague of mine who I appreciate very much, Stanislaw Burzynski, has been a pioneer in what is known as alternative cancer treatments. And for a couple of years, for 1 year, I had a chance to work with him very closely as the FDA was literally choking him out just by roadblock after roadblock. And as of August last year, his whole operation in Texas had a very significant lift up because suddenly patients started coming back, being able to come back, and he didn't have to wait. I saw two little a 40-year-old and a 5-year-old kid came to me as patients for the Burzynski treatment, and I saw them die from brain tumors while I was waiting after all the paperwork for approval from FDA. This was literally choking him or his clinic out of business. And now things have changed. So there's an actual very practical application of this law that has been very positive. So I definitely agree very much with Brad in terms that this has to come from the people. Since everybody has mentioned what is going to happen tomorrow, I will bring a little bit, because tomorrow I'm going to bring a lot of what is it, like a stimulate your thinking quite a bit, because the answer is there. We are facilitators, but the process is not ours. The process is yours. So with that, I'll pass along the microphone.
Thank you, Gaston. Very nice. Ooh, I get to stand. Wow. Yeah, it's way easier when you're walking around anyway. So I'm going to walk in front of you guys because this cord's too tight. So my name is Carla Kay. I'm one of the founding members of Skunk Farm Research. And my association with this group is tied very closely to the use of cannabis. And so in the 10, maybe more, 15 years that I've been working with patients using cannabis, from MS to cancer, and probably the last and most significant in my life was taking care of my late-stage Alzheimer's mother. But what I want to talk about right now is what's been mentioned before. Right to Try is just the start. And really, it's highlighting the reason that we got here to begin with. And that's each and every one of us have systematically given up our responsibility to take care of ourselves, our responsibility to drive correctly, our responsibility to eat the proper food, our responsibility to look what's wrong with us, to seek what's inside, to look at what feels bad, to look at what we need to heal ourselves. We have to take responsibility for our own health. I mean, even when you go to see a Western medicine doctor today, and they give you Western medicine pharmaceuticals, and you go home and the painkiller that they gave you makes you too high, or it doesn't do the job, you go back to that doctor and you say, well, this wasn't strong enough. This didn't kill my pain. I need more. Or something different. This didn't work. Or, my God, what are you trying to do? I'm not a stoner. I mean, you need to cut this dose back a little bit. I'm like spinning in the clouds. So, we're already starting to do that. I know my mother took medicine that made her dizzy. She took medicine that made her sick. She took medicine that let her puke. And she would continue to take it because some doctor told her that that's what she should do, and she didn't pay attention to what her body was telling her. So what we need to do today is take back that responsibility and live up to what we were put on the face of this earth to do, and that's to take care of each other and to start by taking care of self. And so that's my point in what we need to do today to resolve this issue, and it's already started. You know, look at the push for health foods. Look at all the health food grocery stores that we have now. When I was a kid, there were no health food grocery stores. The health food grocery store was out in my garden. It still is, by the way. And I can. I mean, that's a lost art. Who cans anymore? Who makes their own food? I am certainly not going to eat tomatoes that are in a can. Put them in glass where they belong. So we need to take responsibility for self. And that's my belief. Thanks so much for your time.
Boy, I feel like I've been put on the spot. Why didn't you put me first? What a great bunch of people that have talked to us tonight about what they're doing in the way of health. I'm honored to be on the same table with you guys, and thanks, Brad, for getting me invited to this. My name is Peter Starr. I'm not a doctor, and it's a good thing, because the government cannot take away my license to practice. They can accuse me of practicing medicine without a license, however, but hopefully that'll never happen, because I have the world's greatest lawyer sitting to my right here. So
Got my card.
I do have your card. I have your number. The reason I'm here is because 12 years ago I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And it was a very unusual case of diagnosis because by all intents and purposes I shouldn't have been diagnosed because there was no symptoms. And the reason I got diagnosed was a failure in the insurance system in America, which I'll get into tomorrow in great detail. And but I did get diagnosed, and I was diagnosed by a urologist that had the bedside manager of a Neanderthal, to say the least. That's a compliment, I think. And because of that, I decided that what they wanted me to do, and what I was threatened with, that I would die if I didn't do it, was to start researching. After recovering from the fear of what he said and the fear that everybody gets when they're diagnosed with cancer, I decided that I could do something about this, and set about it. And I read and read and read and talked to doctors and come across a program that I live day to day and have done for the last, well, certainly 7 years. It's been 12 years since the diagnosis. It took me about 5 years to figure it out because there really weren't people out there teaching what I had to learn. I had to find doctors that didn't think I was a total idiot. And I had many doctors tell me I'm stupid. Well, some of those doctors are now dead. I'm still here. So that's one of the good things, I guess. I put together a documentary called Surviving Prostate Cancer Without Surgery, Drugs, or Radiation. The reason I did that is because in the preceding 35 years, I made over 40 films that have been on television, documentaries in one form or another. And rather than write a book, I produced a documentary for two reasons. One is because it's what I did, but the other thing is that I did a lot of research about men. Men don't read as a gender. I mean, no disrespect, but as a gender, and some educated people here today, that there's millions out there that get prostate cancer that aren't educated, that don't read. So we did a documentary, and fortunately it's doing quite well. It sells from our website. A shortened version of it was on PBS last year, if you got a chance to catch it or not. And I'll be showing clips of it tomorrow, along with a lot of the story that I learned about being a cancer patient, diagnosed with something they say we're going to kill you, being threatened, intimidated by doctors because they're better educated than I am. And as I turn out now, as I said, some of those doctors are no longer with us, and I'm still here after 12 years. And as somebody said yesterday, you're still kicking ass and taking names, so there you go. But I look forward to speaking with you tomorrow and showing you some film clips and talking to you about the real-life world of being a prostate cancer patient, what it entails, the lies that you are told by the medical profession to ensure that they can control your decision-making process. Because if they cannot control your decision-making process, they cannot make money. There's a doctor in Canada, and I quote him tomorrow with his name, but I can't remember his name right now, that said, if the radical prostatectomies the men are forced into today by intimidation are stopped, at least half of the urology practices in the USA would go belly up. And there's a lot more statistics about that I'll get into tomorrow, of where it's the money that's driving the treatment, that's driving the intimidation, as opposed to the doctor looking after the patient for what's best for the patient. What I'm trying to do with my foundation, it's called Healing Arts Education Foundation, is to educate men before they get that diagnosis. And if they get the diagnosis, to hopefully get to them before they get the biopsy. If they've had the biopsy, to get to them before they have the surgery. If they can't, if I get to them after the surgery, it's to still change their lifestyle, their diet, the way they think. Look at the hormones, hormonal process. Look at the toxins that are in their body. Because the cancer does come back. Because one thing I'll show you tomorrow is that the cancer is not in the tumor. The cancer is systemic, it's in the body. If you take the tumor out, it will come back somewhere else unless you change your diet, your lifestyle, the way you think, and other aspects that we'll talk about tomorrow. And that's what, to me, it's all about. Education, telling people what I've learned. Thank you.
I'm Laura Weeks. Oh, sure.
How come the women get to stand? What is it? Just kidding. It's an English joke.
And there you go. Please join me. So I'm Laura Weeks, and I'm here because, as Brad's wife of almost 30 years now, I've got kind of pulled into a stream of something that I never ever expected I would be a part of. I think, like many people who find themselves at a gathering like this, are not people who are necessarily looking for a cause. You know, I was, you know, I'm a mom. I'd just as soon be home gardening and cooking for my family and helping run a medical practice. And I, like most people, just assumed that we had rights over our own medical choices. And I grew up that way. And the first time I really bumped into any of that limitations, I'd say, was when I got pregnant with our first baby. And Brad and I made the decision, after lots of thought and research and so on, to have our children at home. And so I had my first baby at home. And lo and behold, my husband, who's in medical school at the time, gets told that he would never be accepted into the residency of his choice because I made the decision, we made the decision to have a baby at home. You know, it was kind of like astonishing to me that that would be the case. You know, and then we moved on, and we'll talk more about our 25 years of having a holistic medical practice in the state of Washington and having Brad's license be taken away. But I think it's often not until people bump up against a situation that they get involved. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, that's not until they get sick that they realize that somehow they don't have these kinds of choices that they would like to have. So I think it's wonderful to be in a gathering like this where we can be proactive and we can help get the word out to people, because people need to know this. When somebody gets sick and they realize that they don't have options of the kinds of choices they want, then they're in the moment. Right? Then they're not in the position to start, you know, changing laws or trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to solve an immediate situation, you know. So we've had, just over the course of 25 years, really heart-wrenching situations. You know, one of the ones that comes to mind very recently to me is a mom who called up a year ago or so, and she said, my child has just been diagnosed with cancer. You know, and I went to Children's Hospital in Seattle and had a conversation with me, and they told us we were going to start chemotherapy and radiation, and I asked them, what are my other options? And before she even got a chance to start to think about other options, they told her that if she didn't follow that standard of care, they were going to take her child away. That makes you cry. She called us up. They said, you'd have to find a doctor, a licensed credentialed doctor, to talk with you about other options. Now, in the state of Washington, they're taking them out, left, right, and center. You know, anybody who's out of the box is getting their licenses challenged. In the state of Washington, probably, 75% of the holistic medical doctors in the state of Washington have been challenged by the state medical board. Doctors are afraid to put their head up above water in the state of Washington these days. So I'm here because I've gotten on this wave, you know, because we find ourselves in a situation where we have to be able to talk about these kinds of issues. So my topic of conversation tomorrow is really going to be more about how is it that doctors aren't allowed to serve patients who want choice, and what's some of that history that has brought us to the point we are at in terms of the function of the state medical boards and some of the kind of corporate medical system that it's not by accident, right? But what has been some of that process, the strategic process on the part of the system that's gotten us to where we are today. So thanks for being here.
Well, I'm going to stand behind y'all. Now you know why I'm so honored that this panel came all this way to Kachara to share their knowledge. When the first one said okay, I'm like, wow. And then this one talks to this one, and this one, hey man, we need to support this deal. And I am absolutely overwhelmed, and I hope I can live up to, and my staff can live up to, the honor that we've been given here today. I hope that all of you will call your buddies, because I know some buddies are coming tomorrow. We still have rooms, and there's no charge, y'all. We just want y'all to come up and hear what we're doing here, and just eke this stuff in, that they're so smart. Coffee starts at 7 in the morning in the lobby. No, it's just going to be there. It's just going to be there, Peter. You can go, yep. And I know that some of the speakers want to work with Chris about the projections and all that stuff. So Chris will be, Chris will, he's probably off doing something. We'll find him, and then y'all can just let him know when you want to do that. We'll also have a breakfast bar in the morning, so down in the lobby. So please come at 8 o'clock for breakfast, or just come and hang out, and maybe we'll have an actual fireplace down there in the morning. It's kind of like before and after, but in the same event. So it's really cool. Thank you so much, and I hope y'all get some rest. No.
Danny's curry.
That guy back there, yeah. Oh, stop. Y'all are too kind. I want to introduce y'all to my husband, Scott. Way in the back, there he is. The light shining off his head. That man is basically single-handedly rehabbing this inn, and he's working 24 hours a day for this dream. Was not a believer in the beginning, but after hearing all of these YouTube videos and speeches that these guys made, you know, his comment is, man, how do we turn the Titanic around? But I want to be a part of it. And so, you know, he does more than half. So thank you all. Thank you all the Kachara business owners and MDs and the press that are here. Y'all have a great evening. If you need anything, you could probably just stick your head out the door and say, Chris, because our communication system isn't in yet. So we're just going to treat it like family. All right. Thank y'all. Get some great...